This is Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan Proft and Amy Jacobson on AM 560. The Answer.
Good morning, Dan and Amy. We'll continue our discussion about John Brennan and the revocation of his security clearance. All this is to say, there's mixed opinion among Republicans on it, but Rand Paul is happy. I mean, he was calling for it weeks ago when the prospect first came up that this could happen as the Trump administration reviewing the security clearances to a number of Obama-era intel officials.
Well, I told the president in private what I've been saying in public, that I think there's a great danger to having talking heads on TV who are ex-CIA agents and still have classified clearance. There's a real danger that they might inadvertently reveal classified information. And, John Brennan's got a history of this. Back in 2012, when we were discussing, we discovered the underwear bomber. John Brennan at that time briefed ex-CIA agents who were retired but still had top secret clearance. He briefed them and said, oh, don't worry, the U.S. has someone inside. We have inside control. Well, then one of these ex-CIA agents went on television and said, oh, yeah, we have a double agent and nobody needs to worry. And it's like, whoops, the double agent was still there. So John Brennan's already been involved when he was on the inside, leaking information to people who still had top secret clearance, who were now talking heads. John Brennan leaked information that almost cost the life of a double agent. This is 4 years ago now.
And
that's just one of the discrepancies.
And at least Rand Paul is consistent, too, about, once your time in government is over, unless there's extenuating circumstances, just as a matter of course, security clearances should be revoked. And I'm sort of with him in that camp, but I'm certainly with President Trump on this one. And the rest of the security clearances for this, the remaining persons of interest, if you will, Power and Hayden and Clapper, should also go, as far as I'm concerned. For more on this, as well as the Manafort trial, which goes to the jury today, we're pleased to be joined again by Andy McCarthy, who's a former chief assistant U.S. attorney in Manhattan and now contributing editor at National Review. Andy, thanks for being with us again. Appreciate it.
Dan, Amy, how are you?
Good. You're, as somebody who worked in the Department of Justice and U.S. Attorney's Office in Manhattan, what's your view on security clearances with respect to law enforcement or intelligence officers after their careers in federal government are over?
Well, I think at some high-ranking levels, Dan, it's worthwhile to allow people to keep their security clearances because there's often, with the incumbent people, a need for to be able to resort and consult with their predecessors for institutional memory, for things that went on, for advice and that kind of consultation. I mean, I think it's helpful to the country that, for example, I have no idea if Jim Woolsey still has his security clearance, but I think it would be a good thing for the country, for the Secretary of State or the CIA director to be able to bring in Jim Woolsey and say, here's what's going on. What do you think?
Right. I see that.
On the other hand, I'm a firm believer in that the principle that if you politicize intelligence, you should be gone in terms of your security clearance. And what I have resented about Brennan, I don't begrudge him having political views, and I don't, you certainly don't forfeit that when you get a security clearance. But what I think is really poisonous is this idea of former intel guys who go on television and give you in this kind of sotto voce, nod and a wink way. If only I could tell you what I knew, you'd be demanding Trump's impeachment forthwith. But that kind of game is not what that's not what's supposed to be played. I was looking this morning, interestingly, because I thought you might bring this up. I was comparing Brennan's tweets to General Hayden's tweets. And I think a number of General Hayden's tweets, General Hayden was also a CIA director in the past. I think a number of General Hayden's tweets are ill-advised for him. For example, comparing Trump's border enforcement policy to Nazi Germany. I think that's a mistake on his part. But at least it's a political policy objection. He's not out there saying, I have all this secret information, and when it finally all comes to light, everyone's going to see how corrupt the president is, which is the game that Brennan's playing. And again, I think you got to draw the line between people's right to hold political positions versus a right they don't have, which is to exploit their privileged access to intelligence for political purposes.
Well, the left is saying that Trump is taking revenge on a critical voice. But he was critical. I mean, he called him everything from a traitor to a danger to this country.
Yeah, Amy, here's a problem. I mean, I think you could probably come up pretty quickly with about 10 different times that President Trump does the right thing for perhaps the wrong reason. And I think it would have been better for him, and I'm not, this is not Monday morning quarterbacking. I said this when this issue first came to the floor, 6 weeks ago or whatever it was. I think he would have been better served by taking somebody who had a lot of respect, or maybe a couple of people who had a lot of respect on both sides of the aisle for intelligence experience. People like, I don't want to go into it because I'll leave somebody out. But my point at the time was, review all the people who are former government officials who have security clearances with an eye toward, do we really need them to have them? And have they done anything to abuse them? And then I would have put Brennan in the pot of, the first pot of people that got it yanked, so that it didn't either appear to be or that it wasn't, in fact, just a political retribution and, just the kind of games playing that goes on. I think that the president would have been much better served by doing it that way than singling Brennan out the way he has.
Well, yeah, I think that's a fair point, although there's two additional points. One is you say, Brennan, he essentially has no utility to this administration, so why would I allow him to continue having a security clearance? I'm not going to solicit his advice, nor are my relevant agency heads, and we wouldn't believe it if he, offered it or we solicited it because of everything that we've just described in terms of what he said, and he has the secret knowledge, and he takes credit for the entire Trump collusion investigation, so he has no utility. We don't see him as a valuable asset, so why should he be conferred this special status? He shouldn't be. And then in terms of Brennan and the left and the whole silencing matter, the irony is lost on a guy saying he's being silenced by the president, who's talking about being silenced by the president on cable TV news networks and in an op-ed in the New York Times today.
Yeah, well, I guess two things. On your last point, in the former administration, when people with top secret clearances like General Flynn and General Mattis said things that were based on fact but cut against administration narratives, they didn't lose their security clearances; they lost their jobs, right? So they had a way of purging people as well, and there's a political component to this sort of thing. There always is. On the other hand, and this goes back to your first point about whether we really need these people to have security clearances or not, I totally agree that if somebody abuses or exploits his privileged access to national defense information, that access ought to be yanked. But on the other hand, if you remember, it was only about a month ago, maybe more than that, we had Peter Strzok in a congressional hearing. I was going to say on the stand, but he wasn't in a courtroom. He was at a congressional hearing, and he gave very extensive testimony. After giving extensive testimony out of the public eye, and before he gave that testimony, he had to have access to the classified information in order to be able to answer Congress's questions. Now, admittedly, he didn't answer all of Congress's questions, but the point you can easily understand is that he still has current relevant knowledge and is still a relevant person in connection with investigations that Congress is conducting. So I think you have to take it on a case-by-case basis and say, is there still, I agree with this part of what you're saying, is there still a current need for this person, whether he agrees with the administration, whether we find him useful or not, is there still a current need for him to have access? Because as a practical matter, we know we're going to need him to testify, and he can't really testify unless he can review the documents.
Yeah,
Oh,
it's
so
true.
you don't think President Trump's going to pull his security clearance?
Yeah, but Amy, what if he pulls it and then they have to give it back to him because it turns out that the Inspector General needs to talk to him in order to complete the investigation into the FISA abuse?
Or if
it's going to look silly if they yank it and then they just have to give it back to him, or else he can't testify. I mean, it's not fair. I'm no Strzok fan,
right.
but I'm a sort of a due process fan, right? And I did this for a long time. You have to give people a fair. If you're gonna say that they're relevant witnesses, you have to give them a fair opportunity to testify truthfully and completely. And if they need to review documents in order to do that, I think you got to let them do it.
Sure. I mean, the president could need Brennan or Clapper to go live before Congress again. So you never know when that'll be useful.
But Dan, I'm distinguishing Brennan because I think he did abuse his privileged access. And
I know.
If you abuse your privileged access, you shouldn't get it.
Yeah, I hear. I mean,
I hear what you're saying.
Yeah.
We're not in disagreement.
No, I know.
I just have I have experience with a number of these situations where you think you're cutting someone off because you don't need them anymore, and then you turn out, lo and behold, you need them. And I'm saying that I have experience in this because these are mistakes I've made, just like everybody else makes. You think you're not going to need some source of information, so you burn them, and then all of a sudden unanticipated things come up, and what do you know? You need to talk to the guy again.
That's a fair point, and I think the idea of this being done on a case-by-case basis makes a lot of sense. So I don't disagree with that. I want you to get. I should say I want to get your take on the Manafort trials that goes to the jury today, because I know you've been following it and you've written extensively about it at National Review online. And
the defense called no witnesses.
It was
not one.
An interesting strategic choice to not mount a defense, and it seems to me that the Manafort defense team wants the jury to turn this case up or down on Rick Gates, the prosecution's star witness.
Yeah, that's absolutely what they've done, and I must say, I applaud them for doing it the way they did. I'm not talking about like the substance and the merits of the case, but what you find a lot of times, I'm just clinically looking at this as a trial lawyer. What you do a lot of times is you decide we're going to try to make this case all about the government's accomplice. And then it comes time to put in the defense case, or the court has to ask you, is the defendant going to testify? Are you going to put in any evidence? And a lot of times these defense lawyers hedge their bets at that point, and they think, we better do something here, because otherwise if this guy gets convicted, they're going to say later on that, we gave him ineffective assistance of counsel, that we should have called witnesses, that we signaled to the jury that we had no defense and all that stuff. Whereas the smart thing to do is, if you believe the best defense in the case is to try to turn the case into an up or down referendum on the government's accomplice, here Gates, then put your money where your mouth is and make the case all about him. And that's exactly what they did. So it may not work, but I do agree with them that it was the best strategy to follow.
And it's the best strategy because Gates is such a slimy figure.
I think it's for that reason, but also, in every one of these cases where you have an accomplice, the accomplice is a slimy figure. I mean, it happens almost 100% of the time. But here, I think the real problem for Mueller, and this is not to say it's not a problem he can't overcome, because let's remember, they were ready to go to trial without Gates, right? They indicted this case without Gates. This case is really proved on these documentary financial records. And Gates, in a lot of ways, for them is gravy. I think he really tightens up the evidence on Manafort's intent more than anything else. The case is based on the documents. But the thing that Mueller did here, which I think could come back to bite him, is the plea deal that he gave to Gates is atrocious. I mean, it's a violation of Justice Department plea policy. You're supposed to force someone who wants to plead guilty and cooperate to plead guilty to at least the most serious, readily provable count, which in this case is bank fraud. So in my old office at the Southern District of New York, that wouldn't have been enough. We would have made a cooperator plead guilty to everything, because if you do that, if the guy lies, he's looking at years and years in jail. You're not giving him a benefit before he's done anything for you. And at the end, if he does cooperate, you can make a motion that allows the judge to sentence him under the guidelines, even to time served. What they did with Gates, to the contrary, was a day after indicting him to felonies that would have run up like hundreds of years in prison, they pled him out to 2 minor counts, which capped his exposure at 10 years. They did a number of other technical things. I won't get into the legal weeds of it, but in order to protect him and limit his exposure beneath the sentences that Congress prescribed for some of the crimes. And they basically gave him a big, big benefit before he had done a thing to cooperate with them. So they totally front-loaded it. And what the jury now knows is that here you have Manafort and Gates, who've committed exactly the same crimes. And Mueller is asking them to convict Manafort to crimes that'll make him spend the rest of his life in jail, whereas he has arranged for Gates to walk out the door on the very same conduct. And I don't think the jury's going to like that.
Interesting. Andy McCarthy, former chief assistant U.S. attorney in Manhattan, contributing editor to National Review. You always want to check out his writings on all things legal and some of the specific, more high-profile events like the Manafort trial right now. Some very good analysis. Andy McCarthy, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thanks. Have a great weekend.
You too.
And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer.